father gone without a trace.
She said Tim was missing, and I said, what do you mean missing? I mean, isn't he home?
An old friend with a nasty reputation.
He was trouble. He always was trouble. I didn't realize he was such a monster.
A shocking betrayal that no one saw coming.
I couldn't believe it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up.
Saratoga Springs, New York. This small, picturesque town is an ideal place to raise a family. But for Dana Reisdorf, all is not well. Last night, her husband didn't come home. Tim Reisdorf is a loving spouse and devoted father. This isn't like him. Hours pass without word, and Dana, now frantic, calls Tim's sister.
She said Tim was missing, and I said, what do you mean missing? I mean, isn't he home? And she's like, no, he's been missing now for a day or so, and no one knows where he is. Do you think maybe he just up and left? Just went just to get away? And she says, no, he would never leave little Tim.
Dana last spoke with Tim at 1 in the morning. He said he'd run into an old friend who needed some help and would be home soon. She never heard from him again. 24 hours after Tim's disappearance, Dana files a missing persons report.
The initial conclusion from the officers was that Tim had just left home for a couple days, that this was a husband-wife situation.
But Dana knows that couldn't be further from the truth.
This isn't rocket science. Tim Reisdorf should have been home. He had his sister-in-law's wedding the next day. He had to pick up a tuxedo, get his hair cut, get his car washed, and most importantly, watch his son's soccer game. He should have been home with his family.
Tim Reisdorf grew up in the small town of Troy, New York, the 7th of 9 kids. At age 35, Tim marries Dana. They moved to peaceful Saratoga Springs and settled down to raise their son, Timmy.
Tim was a good guy. He was a funny guy, awesome sense of humor.
By day, Tim works at a recycling plant. In the evenings, he plays in a popular band. His sister Christine is his biggest fan.
He had such talent. I always told him he should take off, get away from this place, and get yourself into a really good band. And he's definitely a family man. And he's always there. He was always there when I needed him. And I was always there for him when he needed me.
According to Dana, Tim was always a happy, easygoing guy. Until lately.
Well, Dana told us that Tim had been very solemn over the last couple of weeks, that she could tell that he was concerned about something. When she would ask him what the problem was, he'd tell her, oh, nothing, I'm just thinking. But she knew that something was bothering him. He just wouldn't fess up to her, that he was a very private person.
Investigators pressed Dana to find out what's changed for Tim in the past couple of weeks. The only thing she can think of is that an old friend recently came back into his life.
After about an hour of talking to Dana, she said that Tim had recently been hanging around with a guy from Troy, New York.
Unfortunately, Dana doesn't know the man's name. Police searched the Reisdorf's phone records for anything that could lead them to Tim or his old friend.
Well, in law enforcement circles, we did what we call a phone dump. It's a subpoena to the phone carrier for a certain number, and we ask for a 24-hour period of records on that number, all incoming and outgoing phone calls made. We then identify the calls of interest, and we get further information on the source of those calls. Timothy made his last phone call to Dana at 1 a.m. Sunday. That phone call was made from a payphone in front of Dunkin' Donuts.
As for the old friend, there's no record of any communication. But based on what investigators find when they question Dana at home, they have to wonder if Tim and his pal were doing something illegal.
I noticed the furnishings and how well kept the place was. The couch was gorgeous, nice leather couch. The appliances were brand new. A lot of money was spent on the interior of this apartment. As I talked to Dana about Tim, I couldn't help but wonder, where did they get all this money for the furnishings?
One of the questions we asked Dana was Tim involved in anything illegal? Her reply to us was, no, Tim is not involved in anything illegal. The only time Tim even leaves the house is to take my son to the soccer game or to go to work. Other than that, he's a great husband, and she had no concerns.
Officers have to wonder how the one-income couple could afford the high-end items that filled their apartment.
When I asked her about all the furnishings and the money, she said Tim was in a band, he was a drummer, and he had a lot of gigs, he was really good, and Tim just got the money.
Investigators think there has to be more to the story and follow up on a hunch.
On occasion, Tim would rent self-storage units, and it's well known to police and law enforcement, that's a good place for bad guys to hide bad stuff.
The hunch pays off big time. Investigators discover a unit in Reisdorf's name, and the manager of the facility confirms that Reisdorf came here on the night of his disappearance. As police wade through security footage, they catch another break. A truck is seen pulling up to Tim's unit, but Tim is not the driver. It's someone that Detective Jim Horton knows all too well, career criminal Gary Evans.
Gary Evans, I couldn't believe it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up.
I was very surprised. They haven't hung out together in a very long time. And Tim pretty much moved on with his life. You know, he got married and has a son and has a good job. He's doing well. I just, no clue why we'd go back with Gary. He was trouble. He always was trouble.
Evans may very well be the last person to have seen Reisdorf alive. But as investigators will soon find out, the man that stands between them and the truth is more elusive than they could ever imagine. Saratoga Springs, New York, fall of 1997. Officers investigating the disappearance of Timothy Reisdorf have made a connection to a wanted criminal named Gary Evans, a man that senior investigator Jim Horton knows all too well.
So 1985 was the first time I met Gary. I arrested him for a burglary. Gary ended up in state prison, and while in state prison, he wrote me letters to my office, and I would respond back. Eventually, when he got out of prison, he called me, and I ended up getting him a job at a landscaping outfit because he loved the outdoors. He had a lot to offer. He was an intelligent person. I foolishly thought I could set him straight, but that lasted about a week, and he ended up back in his life of crime.
Evans has an uncanny ability to stay one step ahead of the law. He tracks police using counter-surveillance and disguises himself to avoid detection.
Gary would change his appearance, both in dress and his looks, such as he'd dress as a hiker or even as a biker with leather, or he'd grow a beard or shave it or grow a goatee, changes his sideburns. He was very cunning and a bit paranoid. I always used to call him the chameleon.
2 days after Reisdorf vanished, officers find their first big lead some 40 miles away in Rensselaer, New York.
Rensselaer police were patrolling through the train station lot. The officer noticed a vehicle parked with its lights on. And upon running the license plate through DMV inquiry, he came back with a hit as involved in a missing person case at Saratoga Springs. At that time, their agency called our agency and alerted us that they had recovered the vehicle.
It's Tim Reisdorf's car. And in the trunk, a surprising discovery. A backpack filled with the kinds of tools thieves use for breaking and entering. Seems the family man was living a double life. Detectives are more desperate than ever to track Evans down, or someone who knows where he is.
I was able to obtain Gary's federal prison records from his stay up in Vermont. And within those records was his visitation list. And within that list was the name of Joanne Donovan. He confided in her. In fact, they had a sexual relationship. So this is just the break we needed.
The plan is to develop a relationship with Joanne and get her to lure Evans back to New York State. As she opens up to investigators, they come to realize that Reisdorf is not the only Evans associate who's gone missing. Joanne's former boyfriend and the father of her child, Damien Cuomo, vanished 8 years ago without a trace. He'd been a childhood friend of Evans and his partner in crime.
His friends, family, etc. think he fled to California, which made some sense because he was wanted for burglary.
And when Cuomo went missing, Gary stepped in to take care of his buddy's girlfriend, in more ways than one. In October of 1997, not long before Tim Reisdorf's disappearance, Gary tells Joanne he has to leave town to hide from police.
She was the last one to see him. So I needed to befriend Joanne and gain her trust because she was going to be my bait to get Evans back in this area. So I obviously had to gain Joanne's trust. I couldn't do it in one sitting, obviously. So I would do the pop-in to her apartment. Anytime, day or night, the door would be ajar. I'd walk in and she'd be getting high or she was intoxicated.
Week after week, he won't stop until he's earned her trust.
So I never busted her for any of the things. Obviously, I'd look around the apartment. There was some stolen property, the drugs. My goal was a lot bigger than this.
As the months go by, Joanne eventually warms to the detective. Horton has found his way in.
I'd give her money on occasion. I'd call her up on the way over and say, do you need anything? I'd stop and get groceries for her. This was a long friendship-building relationship. My motive was to get Gary back here, and I needed her to confide in me if he ever got a hold of her or returned to the area.
Joanne agrees to work with police, and 7 months after Tim Reisdorf's disappearance, she gets word that Evans is trying to reach her. But he's too smart to call her directly. Worried Joanne's phone is tapped, he contacts a local bartender who then relays a message to Joanne.
Joanne immediately contacted me and said that Gary had called and asked them to tell her to be there the next day to receive a call from Gary.
From past experience, Horton knows Gary can smell a trap. Investigators must proceed with extreme caution.
We did a wiretap on the bar, and we did a loose surveillance, but we kind of laid off her. All we could do was just wait.
Now, it's up to Evans to make the next move. Police have wiretapped a bar about 25 miles outside of Saratoga Springs, New York, and are waiting for wanted criminal Gary Evans to call his former girlfriend, Joanne Donovan. After a suspiciously brief conversation, Joanne is out the door. Police follow close behind.
So Gary made her go to 3 different bars. She goes to the first bar, comes out a minute later, jumps in the car, goes to a second bar. We don't know what's going on. We don't have time to get a wiretap. So we're just doing a loose surveillance and waiting. So we're watching from afar. I know Gary does counter surveillance. So, you know, I'm looking for him, he's looking for us.
Evans knows the risks involved in contacting Joanne. He has several outstanding warrants for robberies. But he's broke and desperate. He asks her to bring him her car and some information about antique stores he can rob.
So the end result of this third bar and the phone call was Gary told Joanne to meet him the next day at 1 o'clock at a fast food restaurant right in the center of town in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, which happened to be 5 hours away from where we were.
If all goes to plan, Evans will be in custody soon, and investigators can question him about his missing associates, Reisdorf and Cuomo. Detective Horton coordinates with authorities in Vermont. Together, they plan their takedown.
I was in charge of detectives for the Vermont State Police in about a quarter of the state. I was contacted by Jim Horton with the New York State Police, who was asking for our assistance with the possibility of apprehending Gary Evans. We did a joint surveillance where we were attempting to sweep up Evans without further incident.
We had obviously a briefing with our counterparts from New York, and we developed a plan between the two teams on how we would do this. Again, making sure that we took a lot of precautions with this man.
Evans is a big-time criminal about to roll into a very small town, and there's a lot at stake. If caught, Evans will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars.
We were told that Mr. Evans had a very extensive criminal history, that he was being investigated for murder, and that we had warrants for him in Vermont, and he was basically an escape artist, that if we took him into custody, he would do everything he could to try and escape.
Fearing a violent confrontation, Horton makes a last-minute decision. He takes Joanne Donovan out of the equation.
Gary had no intentions of returning to this area or going to prison for life, obviously. He once told Joanne that he had guns and he wouldn't be taken alive or live in a cage for the rest of his life. I made a decision to pull Joanne from the meet. As much as she wanted to help us, she was still in love with Gary, and that would have compromised the whole operation.
But there's a problem. Joanne has already left for Vermont. The only way to stop her from heading straight to the meeting is to catch up with her on the road.
So I stayed out of town with the Vermont State Police. He was on the side of the interstate, and I was on the exit ramp, laying in the weeds. I'm thinking this could be the best day of my career or the worst day of my career. When I heard a car come down the ramp, I'd peek out to see if it was Joanne. So I finally see Joanne come down the exit ramp, and I jump out of the weeds and I stop her.
At the designated meet, armed officers are ready and waiting. This takedown must go exactly to plan, or things could quickly spin out of control.
And here I am orchestrating his capture in this quaint little Vermont town at a fast food restaurant, and I'm terrified we're going to have a shootout.
A fast food restaurant in quiet St. Johnsbury, Vermont, hums with tension as police prepare for what could become a violent confrontation. Career criminal Gary Evans is wanted for questioning in the disappearances of two men, Damian Cuomo and most recently, Tim Reisdorf.
Well, there were a number of us that were in the downtown area at that time. We were all in plain clothes so that we wouldn't be readily identifiable. There was some tension in the air, obviously, based upon the dangers that were presented by Mr. Evans and the information that we had. We had no idea what to anticipate his reaction was going to be when, in fact, we were going to confront him.
I remember at the briefing that this was related to us to be a very dangerous individual that we had to be very careful with, that he was an extreme flight risk, and that this would be an above normal arrest situation for us.
We had intelligence that Gary Evans would be heavily armed. that he probably possessed 2 handguns. In addition, he had made the comments that he would never be taken alive. We're extremely fearful of a major conflict within the village of 𝐁𝐥𝐸𝐴𝑠𝑏𝑢Rg.
We had 8 or 10 undercover state troopers in various locations around the fast food restaurant. And we also had a couple just on the street walking around like regular citizens. So Evans is across the street in a little park area waiting for Joanne, and the surveillance team simultaneously comes out of their hiding spots and just hone right in on him. Gary felt the presence of the police officers honing in on him. He jumped up and they pounced on him.
As we rushed in and announced ourselves as police and drew our guns on him, I recall that as he stood up, he took a very cautious look around at all of us. He seemed to be sizing us up. As soon as the dog came out, and I think he realized at that point he was just faced with overwhelming force, and it wasn't the time or place for him, so he gave up.
Over the radio, I could hear subject in custody without incident, which means they've got him. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was shot at. It was a feeling that, you know, I was so relieved that this went down the way it did. Nobody was hurt, and we got the prize, Gary Evans.
He was subsequently searched after the arrest, and during the course of the search, we actually found a handcuff key underneath the face of his watch. It was a clear indication to us at the time that he had a plan in place in the event that he was actually arrested.
Detective Horton is determined to find out what happened to the missing men, but knows better than to try to force a confession.
So Gary's back in the Albany jail for about a week, and I purposely don't reach out to him. I let him reach out to me, and that's the way Gary was. You always had to do things on his terms.
Evans plays right into Horton's hands. He contacts the detective and asks to see him face to face.
We sat down together and tried to reacquaint ourselves. It had been 2 years since we had talked or even heard his name. And I didn't mention Tim Reisdorf by design. We just talked old times, tried to catch up, tried to calm him down a little bit. And after 7 hours, I finally said, "Hey, Gary, we got to really talk about something." So at this point, I used Tim Reisdorf's son, Timmy, by design, of course. And I told Gary that Timmy was still home with his face pressed against the glass window, just waiting for Dad to come home. And Gary started to well up. I could tell he was at an emotional peak, and he just looked at me with a smirk and said, "It's going to be hard." And I said, "What do you mean hard?" He said, "It's going to be hard to find."
What comes next is a shocking confession.
So Gary told me he shot Tim right within the self-storage unit.
Evans didn't think Reisdorf could keep quiet about the burglaries they committed together. So while Tim is distracted, Evans takes aim and kills his old friend.
Then he cut up his body with a chainsaw. After that, he went to the market to get some garbage bags and some bleach and paper towels to clean up the blood.
Horton breaks the news to Tim Reisdorf's family.
Well, I know exactly the day. It was June 20th of 1998. It was my anniversary. There's a knock at the door, and sure enough, it's Jim Horton. I knew this can't be good. So he explained what happened to Tim. Of course, you know, you don't want to believe it, but it's just so much to take in at the time. It's like, I just can't believe this is happening. It's like a horror story. It's like, this doesn't happen in real life. Dana, she was just in shock. She couldn't believe it either. I mean, I felt bad for her, and, you know, she's lost her husband. My nephew lost his dad. I lost my brother. It was just a sad day, very sad.
Evans leads investigators to Tim Reisdorf's remains, buried in several boxes in a field outside of Troy, New York. Over the next 5 days, Evans shares even more with Detective Horton. He admits to robbing and then killing 2 antique dealers in New York State. One in 1989, the other in 1991. Evans also admits to killing a former accomplice named Michael Falco.
Evans says he killed Falco in Troy, New York, threw him in the back of a car in a trunk, and drove him down to Florida where he buried him.
Ironically, Evans claims it was Tim Reisdorf who helped him dispose of the body. Evans directs authorities to the gravesite, and sure enough, Falco's remains are right where Evans said they would be. The body count is now up to 4. The only mystery remaining is Damien Cuomo's whereabouts. Joanne Donovan had been living with Cuomo when he vanished. Then Gary Evans steps into her life and convinces her that Damien has left her for another woman. Only Evans knows how far that is from the truth. He tells the detective Cuomo was taking more than his share of their money and had to go.
He kills Damien Cuomo around Christmas time, 1985. But Damien was a wanted man. He was an infamous local burglar, probably a better burglar than Gary, but not as intelligent. And then, being the kind of guy Gary was, he ends up hooking up with Joanne. So Joanne would go to work, and Gary would sneak back in the apartment and make it look like Damien was still around. He would leave clothes out, leave the window open. He creates this whole charade about how Damien's alive and well and just took off. Of course, this upsets Joanne because she thinks that he's left her high and dry. And so much so that she believes this for 13 years.
All told, Gary Evans confesses to a total of 5 murders, leading police to 3 separate burial sites. But it's not a weight off his shoulders. Horton continues to visit Evans in jail, and it's clear he's deteriorating physically and mentally.
When I saw him, I said, Jesus, Gary, take a shower. I mean, he stunk. He had the bluest eyes you'd ever seen, and the blue was actually disappearing from his eye color.
Over the next 2 months, Evans writes to Horton regularly, and the detective can tell he's nearing the end of his tether.
I can see it in his thought process, his ramblings, even his handwriting changed throughout this time. These letters were just an example of his thoughts and his expressions about our relationship, and he thought I was his best friend, but I can assure you he wasn't my best friend.
A court hearing is all that stands between Evans and a life sentence. But Horton can't shake the feeling that Evans has already made other plans.
It was almost as if I knew it was coming, I just didn't know the method. It was almost as if they didn't realize what they had, and they didn't understand Gary's resolve. This was going to happen no matter what.
Career criminal Gary Evans has confessed to 5 murders, including the shooting death and dismemberment of Tim Reisdorf.
I just couldn't believe it. They were friends, good friends with Gary. This can't be happening.
In addition to leading detectives to Reisdorf's grave, he also shows them where he buried Damien Cuomo, Joanne Donovan's former boyfriend. Detective Horton convinces Evans to call Joanne and come clean about his crimes and his years of deception.
So I got Joanne on the phone. I said, Gary wants to tell you something. I handed Gary the phone. He started whimpering and mumbling. I could hear Joanne start screaming.
Meanwhile, Evans waits in an Albany prison, preparing for a preliminary hearing.
In New York State, we have something called the persistent felony law, where, simply put, 3 felony convictions and you're eligible for life in prison. Gary had this, he knew it, and he knew he was going to go to prison for life.
After his hearing, federal marshals load Evans into a van for transport back to the Albany jail. Horton, unable to be there that day, may have been the only person who could have prevented what was about to happen.
It was almost as if I knew it was coming, I just didn't know the method. They didn't realize what they had, and they didn't understand Gary's resolve. This was going to happen no matter what.
Using an old jailhouse trick, Evans has concealed a handcuff key in his nose. He slips his cuffs without the marshals ever noticing and kicks out the window of the van. Then he makes his escape. Before the marshals can catch him, Gary runs to a nearby bridge and his idea of freedom. There's speculation that Gary's death was an accident, but Horton knows him all too well.
Gary could have jumped out of the van anywhere. He could have undone both the leg shackles and the handcuffs. Instead, he chose to jump off an 80-foot bridge. Some people think this was an escape gone bad, when actually it was an escape to commit suicide.
The world is now free from a deranged killer. But for his victims' families, it's not exactly justice.
I got a phone call that Gary jumped off the Manans Bridge. And I was like, how could that happen? He's behind bars. I said, it happened. He escaped. He's dead. And I just couldn't believe it. Kind of bittersweet, you know, it's okay, he's gone. But to me, it was a little bit too quick. I wanted him to stay in prison, just suffer, you know, realize what he's done.
So the last letter I received from Gary was on that Friday, the day he died. And in addition to his usual ramblings, he said, quote unquote, "I win," which from his perspective, he went out on his own terms. He committed suicide rather than go to jail for life. So I'm getting a lot of phone calls from people, including the state police superintendent, my mother, and they're all asking me how I felt about this, because they thought I had feelings for Gary or the whole situation. But actually I was ambivalent. You know, I didn't feel happy, I didn't feel sad. I wasn't gonna shed a tear for this guy.
I was shocked. They were friends. We were friends for a long time. I just never thought Gary would turn on Tim like that. Totally shocked. He just doesn't. Friends don't do that to friends. Not what he did. I didn't realize he was such a monster.